Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session of the day, implementing flexible working practices. Again, my name is Emma Bisco. I am a Learning and Development Coordinator with the Work Wellness Institute. And if you've been to any of our previous sessions, you'll know that I am the one who will be guiding you through today's conference. With that, I would like to begin our time for this session by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. That's the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'd also like to thank our funders, our speakers, all of our partners, and all of you in attendance today for making this possible. Before I hand it over to our wonderful moderator and our fantastic panelists, I just have a few technical housekeeping points to go over first. So we ask that everyone remain muted throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to please use the live chat through Feedloop to submit any questions. We will be collecting those questions and have a question and answer period at the end of our session. For the best viewing experience, I do recommend full screen. There will be some polls in this session, so when those are up, just please engage directly with your screen. And also just make a quick note that this session will transition right into Ask the Expert at the end, where we've invited our wonderful panelists to stay on, and we have our moderator, Todd Humber, from our first session, who will be coming back. So any of those implementation questions will be answered in just a short time. But we're here to first discuss implementing flexible working practices. So to moderate this panel, we are so pleased to welcome Victoria Granger. Victoria is an educator, entrepreneur, fitness enthusiast, enthusiast mom, and passionate advocate for the impact of well-being on performance. She's the founder of Wellness Works Canada, a nonprofit association that empowers, educates, and supports organizational well-being practitioners and employers in building healthy, high-performing work cultures. She has worked in the field of health promotion and population health for 20 years. She has supported countless public, non-for-profit, and private organizations in developing, implementing, and evaluating comprehensive organizational well-being strategies to create environments where people and businesses thrive. So with that, thank you again, Victoria, and I'll hand it over to you to introduce our panelists and session topic.
Thank you so much, Emma, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm calling in here today from Treaty 6 and wanted to acknowledge the land here, and my pronouns are she and her. And it is a pleasure to be here. And, you know, I think this session really ties in really nicely with what we've been hearing this morning and early this afternoon around topics that have been and trends that we've been seeing in the workplace around the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffle, ghosting, all of these different things that are starting to really spread like wildfire across organizations, you know, across Canada and around the globe. And a lot of people are stating the reasons for their shifts or disengagement have to do with a variety of factors, but one of those big factors absolutely is the not having enough flexibility, right? Or not having flexible remote work policies given the work that we live in today and how we're working, right? And I can fully agree and attest to those issues myself as a working mom of young children. And so, you know, I think another big issue that we go into this right before I just introduce these amazing panels that we have today is that we're also living in a day and age where there's an echo pandemic of poor mental well-being, right? Where the mental health issues that people are experiencing are just as high or not, if not surpassing the direct impact that COVID-19 has had on folks. And so this is kind of leading to people wanting to be maybe a little bit disengaged or needing greater flexibility because they're experiencing perhaps a stress injury or experiencing burnout that we heard about this morning and is needing additional support, right? So how can we address these issues and how can we help them? Well, we have two amazing panelists to talk about that today and how we can support flexible workplaces, which is one very important component of course, is what we heard this morning of taking a systems approach to supporting employee well-being and supporting people and organizations to truly perform. So today we have Dr. Claire Kelleher, who's a professor of work and organization at Cranfield School of Management, the Cranfield University in UK. So we have it's definitely a global panel today. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Management, Master's in Arts in Employment Relations, and a PhD in Organizational Behavior from London Business School. And her research over many years has focused on the implementation and outcomes from flexible working arrangements. And she's published the findings widely in books, articles, blogs, and through media commentary. Her research has been used to shape, has been used as evidence in the development of government policy. And also she's worked with employers to shape their working practices as well. And her recent research that's been funded by the Economic Social Research Council has been examining how the use of the UK government-sponsored furlough scheme during the pandemic encourage employers to experiment with part-time working, often challenging their assumptions about its feasibility and making them more amenable to working part-time working in the future, which I'm really excited to hear about that research. And she's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. So we have her, and we also have, so pleased to have you. We also have Andrew Barnes here today. And so if you've heard of the Forward Work Week Global, this is him. He's made a career of market-changing innovation and industry digitization. And most recently, and he's in New Zealand, Andrew made the worldwide headlines by announcing the 4-day week as, announcing the 4-day week as the founder of Perpetual Guardian. And the result has seen him and his partner establish 4-day week global and the 4-day week global foundation. And so their vision is to provide a community environment for companies, researchers and academics and interested parties to be able to connect and advance this idea as a part of the future of work. And so he's on the advisory boards with both the US and Ireland 4-day workweek campaigns and the board of the newly created Wellbeing Research Center at Oxford University. He's the author of the 4-day week book, a how-to guide for companies trying to reduce work hours and increase productivity. And so just so thrilled to be hearing about all of the information here today from our expert panelists. So welcome and thank you for having you. Thank you for being here today. And so we're going to start with Claire, giving a bit of a presentation of your research findings and thoughts. And then we're going to have a little bit of dialogue. Then we're going to have Andrew go in to discuss his, all of his work and some thoughts. And then we're going to have some more dialogue and a kind of an engaging panel discussion. And then, of course, invite questions from all of you lovely folks in the audience. So let's start with Claire. We're just going to pass it off to you to share your expertise here today. Welcome, Claire. Dr. Claire.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here this evening, or this evening in UK time. I guess I should be saying good afternoon to most people who are in the audience. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm also very pleased to be sharing this panel with Andrew. Part of the reason why I say that is I was updating my textbook that I've written on strategic human resource management a few years ago, and I actually wrote a little bit using external sources about the work that Andrew had done. So I'm very pleased to be actually sharing a platform with him on this particular occasion, and really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Andrew, as well. I'm going to try and share my screen now. I've had some technical problems earlier, but I think I'm going to be able to succeed on that. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. Two things that I am going to attempt to do in the time that I have available to me. I've done along with colleagues at Cranfield, done a lot of research on flexible working over the years. And so I want to say a few general words about flexible working, but in line with the comment that Victoria made about some research we've been doing about part-time working, and particularly how the experiences of the pandemic influenced employers' approaches to part-time working, I want to share with you a few results, because we're literally just finishing that project. And so to kind of give some early insight into the work that we've done, which will be published in a few years, in a few weeks' time, we'll be publishing that. So perhaps before I move into looking at this in any detail, I just want to run a quick poll. Emma, I wonder if you would be able to bring the poll up for us. So just a question about some of the forms of flexible working that are taking place in your own organisation. So can we close the poll in a moment and see those results? Okay, so we've got a lot of remote working going on. We've also got quite a lot of adjustment to hours, more than half of our respondents, and similar numbers of people working on a part-time basis. When I'm talking about flexible working, I'm normally talking about people working in different places, people working at different times, and people working in different amounts. I know some definitions of flexible working go beyond that. But just very, now I'm trying to move my slides, which I'm struggling with. Emma, I may need your help here, given it's not allowing me move my slides on. So can I stop sharing and ask you to?
Absolutely.
Okay, just for some very general points about, I think we are now in a position where for the majority of employers, there is this recognition of the need to provide good support for an employees in order to get the best out of them. Perhaps not surprisingly, if we provide support, we recognize individuals, we get better performance from those individuals. And I think in the current context with the economic climate, particularly in those countries that are especially suffering in terms of their economies, and employees struggling with the cost of living and the stresses associated with that, even more important in this context that we provide good support for employees. But I'm going to focus what I say really in relation to flexible working, and the key thing about flexible working that delivers the good results for organizations is this issue around giving employees some degree of choice, allowing them to exercise some choice over their working arrangements. So to be able to fit with their non-life commitments. We are obviously very important for people with caring responsibilities, but also important to recognize that there are others who have different priorities in life about things that are important to them, and being able to balance work alongside their non-work activities. When we think about flexible working, though, the world has changed in many senses as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know more about our employees by getting insights into their home lives through the Zoom calls that we all started having during the pandemic. Remote working has become so much more widespread in very many countries. What was deemed to be impossible became possible almost overnight in many circumstances. But of course, the challenge with hybrid working is often that we're talking about it on a wide scale, rather than seeing it on something that is a relatively small activity in the organisation. So that's something that we will need to explore in a little bit more detail. Emma, could we run the next poll very briefly? So what I want in the next poll is just to ask about why is it that you as employers are offering employees some degree of choice? What's your reasoning behind doing this? So if we could take a moment to have a look at any or all of those reasons. Okay, if we can close up that poll and see where the results are coming in. Yeah, so we don't have any responses of people who are just asking, who are just responding to employee requests. Recruitment being an important factor, recruitment and attention. With that, improving workforce diversity, relatively small on motivation and loyalty. I see there's something in the chat that somebody's only been able to pick one of those, so maybe it's only giving us a limited picture here, but a lot of support in relation to supporting employee work-life balance. Okay, so we've got a variety of reasons. Emma, could we move to the next slide? So, our research, and indeed research of many people on this topic, has shown that one of the biggest factors in giving employees choice, allowing them to fit their working arrangements along with whatever else goes on in their lives, is a really powerful tool for building loyalty, particularly where employees have, quite an idiosyncratic arrangement. It fits them rather than being a standard arrangement or a little degree of shift that is the common across other employees. Of course, being able to recruit from a wider talent pool is an important aspect. By recruiting part-time people or people who can work remotely, we can dig into other talent pools that may not be available to us through standard working arrangements, and can allow us to increase the diversity of our workforce as a result, and all the associated benefits with it. Good evidence in relation to reduced absenteeism rates, although I think we do have to be cautious. There is evidence that people who are perhaps less well will carry on working when they can work remotely, perhaps because they don't need the effort of getting themselves ready for work and traveling to work. But I think we need to be cautious in some ways, because what we don't want people to do is to make themselves less well by continuing to work on a remote basis. Enhanced performance, we've done quite a lot of work around this, and we found that through many studies that employees who get choice over their working environments are often performing better than their counterparts who don't have choice available. And I think two broad reasons. In part, sometimes it just enables people to work better. Remote workers may be able to focus more. They may be able to concentrate their time and their energy and actually achieve more as a result. But a powerful aspect of it that has come through strongly in our work has been about this notion of exchange. Employees reciprocate when employers are prepared to take account of what goes on in their personal lives and allow some adjustments in working time, working place, or the amount of hours working in order to accommodate that better. And employees pay back, if you like, by exercising greater effort alongside that greater loyalty that we often see. Well-being and stress also, important aspects in terms of outcomes, where employees have, less, if they're able to combine work and non-work more effectively, then the challenge of doing so is less of a challenge for their well-being. It's less of distraction and allows them to focus on their work and get satisfaction from their work. Generally speaking, the evidence suggests that it's positive for stress, but I think also we have to recognise that particularly people who are lone flexible workers, maybe the only person in a department, sometimes that can be quite stressful, of keeping up with what's happening with your colleagues if it isn't a culture where flexible working is supported, if they're a lone flexible worker. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, I want to have a look at some of the key implementation issues before giving you a little bit of insight into the research that we've been doing. The implementation issues, could we bring up the points that, I think there's 4 points that if we bring them up together, that will be fine. Clearly, the importance of supervisor support. Again, I think we've learned quite a lot about that during the pandemic, in terms of particularly where people are away from the workplace and are not there at the same time as their co-workers and their supervisors, a more intervention approach to support employees. One study I saw, not our own work at Cranfield, suggested that supervisors need to spend 3 times as much time actively connecting their staff when they work at different times, different places, in order to maintain the same degree of connection with them as they have if they are all co-located, if they're present together. Relationships with co-workers is an important aspect as well. Clearly, that co-workers may feel that they're picking up the pieces for somebody who isn't present, somebody who's working at a different time, and important to kind of work out protocols associated with that. Some types of work better with flexible working than others, but I think I would contend that nearly all types of work offer some potential for flexibility. And clearly also important that organisational support systems take account of different working patterns, rather than just working on a basis of full-time being the norm. I want to move straight on, given in the interest of time, to say a few words about this project that we're just finishing up now. So next slide, thank you. Particularly what I want to talk about is how we've just really examined an experiment in part-time working, which wasn't a planned experiment, but one that took place through the use of the furlough scheme in the UK. And I understand in Canada there's been a similar scheme where employers have helped, where government has helped employers to avoid making people redundant during the pandemic by providing some form of financial support for employees who aren't able to work or only able to work part-time. Just to give you a little bit of context, next slide, please. In the UK, part-time working is already quite prevalent. 1 in 4 people work part-time. So, 25% of the workforce already tends to be concentrated in certain groups, particularly parents and carers, and also older workers. But we have quite strong evidence to show that around an additional 15% of the workforce would like to work fewer hours, but aren't able to access it in the types of jobs that they're in. And of course, it can widen more part-time working. The availability of more part-time working can allow people who would be unable to work on a full-time basis to be able to participate in the workforce, and also those who aren't prepared to work full-time, perhaps particularly older workers that want to retire, might only be happy to work if they can work on a full-time basis, a part-time basis. And I think notably in the UK, perhaps this is particularly important because working hours are, in comparison to many of our competitors, quite long. Interestingly, not a question that I'm going to address in this session, but productivity in the UK isn't necessarily higher, although average working hours are higher. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background to the furlough. The government provided support for employees to be kept in their jobs, not to be made redundant in April 2020. But only a few months later was the flexible version included, where employers could bring people back on a part-time basis. They would pay them for the time that they worked, but that the government would then pay the difference in terms of their earnings. And in the case of the UK scheme, it was 80% of the salary costs that the government would make up. Now, the reason why we wanted to study this and feel that it is remarkable in some senses was that it meant that employers who previously had not used part-time working to any great degree, that they had the opportunity to experiment with it, and also where they'd only used it in certain jobs, very often frontline service jobs, it gave them the opportunity to experiment with part-time working for a broader range of jobs as well. Next slide, please, just to kind of give you the overview of what our study was designed to do. What we wanted to find out was whether or not when employers accessed this scheme to support their businesses, did they indeed change their perceptions about part-time working. The great working from home experiment, we know a lot about employers who didn't think that working from home was particularly feasible in their organization and were able to convert working, and very much opened their opinions about the feasibility of remote working. So we really wanted to know whether or not this experiment in part-time working was a similar one where using it opened up the perceptions. And I would say, I'm going to run through the remaining material fairly briefly, but I would say there were two positive outcomes that we got from this. We found employers learnt quite a lot about how to manage part-time working, particularly those who didn't have much experience in it previously. And we also found those who had previously been resistant to it had become more open, more positive towards allowing part-time opportunities in their workplaces. Next slide, please. I'm not going to read through this quotation, but our survey work showed us that 43% of our respondents said that they were able to manage part-time working more effectively as a result of their experiences in using the flexible furlough scheme. And matching their needs, their staffing to their needs of the business was often about looking at the heat map and saying, where do we have more intense staffing needs, and using part-time employees to fit in line with that. Next slide, please. In fact, perhaps you'd go 2 slides so that we actually move on to the next point. Thank you. So this kind of learning about designing work, we found 40% of our respondents said they learnt about how to design work in different ways in order to fit with the needs of their business. And in the case of this quotation, it was really about, they brought staff back on a basis of everybody worked every day, but they only worked for half days so that they could protect their client relationships, that staff members were always available to their clients, but only for half a day. Next slide. There were also issues about managing productivity that some of our employers spoke about in the interviews, about really how it made them consider the productivity of all their staff more closely when they were planning for how to use the scheme, how to use staff on a part-time basis, and access the government support as a result of this. If you move 2 slides forward, I just want to summarize some of our findings on this. So the openness was something that was also a significant finding from the research, that employers had the experience, often found that their eyes were opened to the possibilities of using part-time working, particularly those who didn't have much experience and perhaps had been resistant to some degree. And just if I point your direction to the last quote, as saying it's always been in the psyche, the awareness, but stopped this, using the furlough stopped the presumption that it wouldn't work. It's forced you to do it. It's disproved your biases, I suppose. And that really kind of summed up the openness. Final slide, please. So we found that the greater openness and learnings from using the scheme were really important in terms of looking to how employers would deal with part-time working in the future. As the world changed and staff shortages became a bigger issue for employers, they've been able to harness that learning and really look at how they put this into practice. And of course, worker demand has shifted too, with some employees wanting to work in different ways to achieve a greater work-life balance, and increasing demand for working on a part-time basis. So employer openness to that has been a positive aspect. The final point, though, I make is that we did also find quite a lot of lack of awareness of unmet demand part-time working. And what I mean by that is many employers assumed if they didn't have requests from employees to work part-time, that meant people didn't want to work part-time. Whereas, of course, if you're in a culture where there isn't much flexibility, there aren't many other people working part-time, employees may not request it because they feel that the likelihood of them being able to work on a part-time basis may be very limited. And as a result, I think we need to encourage a culture where there's kind of open discussion about working hours preferences. I'm going to stop there and hand back to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Claire. I think some of the theme of that was around the choice, right? Providing employees with that choice. And I love how there was a flexible furlough there. In Canada, it was straight across the board. There wasn't a difference, like you could work part-time. We didn't have that. And I think if you were here to give us recommendations, that would have been useful at that time, right? When we were needing that for sure. So, and I think the third thing that I got out of that when you were just mentioning, or at the very end there, around asking employees what they need to be able to know what type of choice to offer, because people don't always think of to ask if something might be an option. So I think we'll get more into some of the logistics, lots of questions to ask a little bit later, but I think we'll let Andrew go up next to review some of the great information and findings that you have with the 4-day week and other things. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Andrew, and then we'll get into a dialogue and talk a little bit more about the logistics, the challenges, implementation, and things like that. So Andrew, off to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Good afternoon, everybody. Look, I always feel a fraud when I'm in these sort of conferences, because actually I didn't start this with anything to do with work-life balance, wellness, or anything else. What I was trying to do back in 2018 was answer a very, very simple question, which was about productivity. How do I improve productivity in my business? And this was prompted by a couple of articles in the UK Economist magazine, which were talking about true productivity in a business being about 3 hours a day, 2.5 to 3 hours a day. I should say that it also said in that self-same piece of research that Canadians were only productive for 1.5 hours a day, which I found quite extraordinary. But there you go. So what I was trying to do was to work out how I could make my business more productive. And I wondered if I could do that by saying to people, actually, what would you do differently? If I gifted you a day off a week, what would you do differently? And that's not just about a process change, it's attitudinal change. It's how you would interact with your colleagues. What would you stop doing? So the thesis behind the 4-day week was very, very simple. Here was a deal where we said we have absolutely no idea how to make this work. What we're going to do is we're going to give the staff the challenge to tell us what they would do differently. They had a month to plan it, and then we ran this little pilot program of about 8 weeks back in 2018. We had researchers running alongside the trial from Auckland University of Technology and Auckland University. And what they were doing was looking at not just the impact on the employee, but the impact on the business in a qualitative and quantitative way. The research, I have to say, was pretty outstanding in a way. We found that engagement scores, engagement, empowerment, enrichment, team cohesion, those sort of scores went up 40%, 40%, to the levels that the researchers said were the highest they'd ever seen in New Zealand. Stress levels dropped 15%, and more people said they were better able to do their job working 4 days rather than 5. So as a consequence of that, we actually then made this policy permanent back in 2018. Now, just as Claire said, the pandemic has then changed everything, because what happened is we got deluged. I mean, we stopped counting when we got to double-figure thousands of articles being written about our little trial in New Zealand. But the reality is, in 2018, that's exactly what it was. It was a crazy company in Auckland trying something different. And then the pandemic hit. And what's happened, of course, is that the two biggest impediments to implementing a 4-day week, no different, by the way, from some of the conclusions that Claire has got about part-time working, The two biggest impediments was, one, can I trust my staff? And secondly, how do I measure productivity? Now, a lot of businesses felt that you could only trust your staff if they could see you. You send them home. Amazingly, you actually have to find out whether you can trust your staff just based on output. The second one's a little bit more interesting, because if you think, the biggest question that I often get asked is, Andrew, well, how do you measure productivity? To which, of course, the answer is, well, how are you measuring productivity? So in a lot of cases, companies are actually using time as a surrogate for output. And the concept of the 4-day week is all about output. We have this concept that we call the 100-80-100 rule. 100% pay, 80% of normal 5-day working, provided we get 100% of productivity and output. And that goes beyond productivity and output. That goes to customer service standards, so that your customers, who are often going to be some of the most skeptical people about implementing, a shorter working week, those are the people you've got to bring on the journey. Now, if we take a step back, is this actually that radical? Well, actually, no, I don't really think it is. I think that the genesis of the 5-day week was a decision, largely credited to Henry Ford, who was trying to work out how he increased a market for his product, namely a motor car. And one of the challenges, obviously, is if you work 6 days a week, you only had a day to actually have leisure. And actually a chunk of that was taken up with going to church. So the need for a car was not that high. But if, of course, you actually have another day off, which is pure leisure, you then have an opportunity to get out, go about, and at that point, you actually need some other form of transportation, which will get you there quickly. The horse and buggy maybe might not do it. So we are in many ways not a different position from that. We've got a society which is rather more focused now on services. And you can see an argument, at least I can see an argument, that if we actually create more time for people, that will not only improve productivity within an organization, but it will actually also create more appetite, more opportunity for society, the economy generally, because people will be spending money or doing things outside of what is normally constrained time in the workplace. Now, a lot of people say to me, well, this has got to be very complicated. How on earth do you implement a 4-day week? And the answer is, when we did this, I had absolutely no idea. We basically winged it. Now, these days, you don't have to wing it. But if you think about what you're trying to do here, you're really saying to your staff, what is it that you're going to do differently? Now, if we go back to that research around 2.5 to 3 hours a day, broadly, by the way, that's a consistent number wherever you are in the world. That basically means that of a workday of 8 hours, there is 5 hours of filler. Now, what form does that take? Well, a bit of that is, you come into the office, you've just had a terrible commute, you got to wind down a bit, you sit down and read the news for a little while, you have a chat to your colleagues, you take a little bit of time to get up to speed. You then get down to do some work, and the first thing that happens is somebody taps you on the shoulder and they interrupt you. Now, statistically, in an open plan office, you will get interrupted once every 11 minutes. It will take you 22 minutes to get back to full productivity. If you are continually interrupted at work, it is believed that it is the equivalent of trying to work under the influence of marijuana. So if you can change that, and we have this concept called a quiet hour. And the quiet hour basically means you put a flag in a pot, and for 1 hour, you can't be interrupted. Now, what that actually does, it's, the deep work concept, it's nothing new. What that actually means is that for each of those hours, I'm getting the equivalent of 3 normal hours of output. Now, basically, that one thing alone, if you do that once a day for 4 days, I've actually picked up the productivity of that 5th day. Equally, think about how many times you go into meetings that you really shouldn't be in, and they go on forever. They have no agenda. Now, a very interesting piece of experiment was done by Microsoft Japan on just meetings. And what they did was they said, right, no more than 5 people in a meeting, no meeting longer than half an hour, and please use Microsoft Teams. And what they found was that productivity went up by 39.9% on meetings alone. Right, so let's add a quiet hour to better meeting discipline. We then did lots of other little things, silly things like you can't eat your lunch at your desk. Why not? Because somebody, comes down, great reheated curry, sitting at the desk, you're about to go to lunch in an hour's time, and all you can think about is when you need to go to lunch because this curry is wafting around. Incidentally, of course, if I send you off to the canteen, which we made larger, to have your lunch, you've got more time to socialize, which balances the time when we're asking you not to socialize, to have that quiet hour. Statistically, again, if you look at your mobile phone once every 5 to 6 minutes. So if you haven't got the strength of character to not look at your mobile phone, in our offices, we now have lockers down the far end of the office where you can lock it away. Now, these are lots and lots and lots of very little hacks. There are no big process changes here. A large chunk of this is all about attitudinal change. Now, 2 types of attitudinal change. We found in our trial that internet surfing on the top 5 non-business related sites dropped 35%. So therefore, people were making a decision that not following the Kardashians was a good idea because actually you had a chance to go home early. Now, it's a small thing, but if it's translated across everybody, again, you're getting bigger output. The next thing is that we made our policy team-based. Now, I'm a great believer that nobody ever goes over the top for a flag or a mission statement. They go over the top for the person on their left and the person on their right. And so if you make this team-based and people start to share the great stories about what they are doing in their time off, what then happens is you get a much stronger and much more cohesive team. And people recognize that they're not just accountable to me, they're accountable to their colleagues, that they have to ensure that they're not wasting their time, just as those colleagues shouldn't be wasting theirs. Because if you do, the challenge is that you have an opportunity that we might have to rescind the 4-day week. Because in our company, the policy is an opt-in policy. And what we do with that is we keep your normal contract of employment, 5-day contract of employment is maintained. And what we say is you will opt in on an annualized basis to say that, okay, I am prepared to ensure that I will stand by the 100-80-100 rule. You'll pay me my 5 days, I'll work 4 days, but you need as an organization to get the same level of output. That's the deal. And if that deal is not met, we can then say to any employee, right, back to 5 days. Now, statistically in the organization, about 85% of the company will do a 4-day week. It varies a little bit from department to department, and we're finding at the moment that often people in Auckland, say, are more skewed a little bit towards working from home on slightly other different terms, because they want to avoid the commutes, whereas out in our branches around New Zealand, the bulk of the staff are signed up to a 4-day week option. So it does vary a bit. The other thing it's worth noting is that whilst we call ourselves 4-Day Week Global, the reality is that's a little bit of clickbait. What we mean is reduced hours working. So we have staff who will work, 4 days, take a day off. We have staff who will take a couple of afternoons off, and we have staff, primarily working parents, who will actually work 5 days a week, but compressed hours. And that obviously means you can take the kids to school, you can pick the kids up at the end of the day. And that has very positive impacts as far as childcare is concerned. Because the key thing here is to give you the time off that is important to you. If I give you time off that isn't important, you won't value it. If I give you time off, for example, we have this chap who's a grandfather, and he does 2 afternoons a week with his granddaughter. And when he talks about it, he cries. Because he's been given something he never believed he could have, which is time with his granddaughter and still be able to work full time. Now, how they structure that is I've not in 4 years got ever involved in a single scheduling exercise for the time. It is worked out by each of the teams, and they appreciate that the key issue here is to ensure that customer service is maintained. In the 4 years of us doing this, we've only ever had to rescind the 4-day week policy once, and that was for one team. And what was happening is effectively that people they decided that half the team would take Friday off and half the team would take Monday off, and then came back and said, and customer service has gone down. Well, sort of no shit, right? So what we do with our organization, we have retail stores, we have to ensure that the branches remain open and they're there to service the customers in the normal way. Now, in the 4 years since we started this has now gone, pretty ballistic, so that I have talked in about 100 countries plus worldwide on this topic. We are running pilot schemes currently in the USA, Canada, Ireland, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. South Africa is about to come online with participants from all the way across Africa. We are working with the Spanish and Portuguese governments, the Welsh government, the Scottish government, and we're looking to launch a trial as well across Europe. So this is now a major global movement, and it's coming to a country and a company near you. And I say that because one of the big challenges now is that the shortage of employees worldwide now means that countries or states are starting to look at reduced hours working as being a solution to attract and retain employees. The latest of these is the state of Victoria in Australia, where the Premier has announced that he will introduce a 4-day week if he gets re-elected in the next few weeks. And primarily, that strategy is to attract and retain workers, because 80% of the employees say, when asked, actually, you know what? I would like a 4-day week. Now, just in case everybody thinks this is mad, and you all did think it was mad, and I thought it was mad, and my shareholders and everybody thought it was mad. Hot off the press is the results from Unilever's trial. And Unilever has been trialing the 4-day week in New Zealand now for 18 months. 2 days ago, they have announced that they are going to roll it out now to their Australian operation. So their results were really quite interesting with a 4-day week. Their stakeholders, 100% of the stakeholders said that the tasks in a 4-day week were completed on time and to standard and to quality. So there was no drop as far as output, productivity, quality of customer service. Absenteeism dropped 34%. In our case, we saw 50% drop. Stress levels dropped 33%. We had about a 15 to 20% drop. Their employees said that their improved strength and vigor, their words, at work went up 15%. And conflicts between work life and home life dropped 67%. So if you think about it, this is now not just me sitting there. And in fact, there are tens of thousands of companies around the world. Everybody from Volkswagen and Panasonic down to a fish and chip shop in Suffolk that is actually trialing the 4-day week. But this is something that is now moving into the mainstream. And I will say to people, actually, it's very simple. The biggest risk you have is not implementing a 4-day week. The biggest risk you have is your biggest competitor does it first. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Andrew. Wow, that was there was so much to unpack there, and so many, I think just amazing statistics as well that you quoted, right? And I wasn't all that pleased to hear that, Canadians are only productive an hour and a half a week or a day, sorry. But I guess not everybody, but there goes the average, right? But it is interesting that I know that Canadians are known for working hard. And we all know that working long hours, we see diminishing returns, right? And so those levels of productivity aren't always going to show up because of that. So amazing some of the research that came out of that too, that you were saying how employee engagement increased by 40%, right? And I mean, employee engagement is there's direct correlation from Gallup with tons of research behind it that performance is impacted positively when we improve engagement. So that is amazing, right? If there's any naysayers out there, that might be one of the big things there. But I was also interested to hear that you were talking about how this, that the 4-day week is actually not necessarily Monday to Thursday and then get Friday off, that it really is what Claire was talking about having flexibility, about having choice and giving people that, because that's probably one of the biggest questions I'm sure that a lot of people have, is how do you make that work logistically if clients are available need to be answered on a Friday and that's not the day, et cetera, right? So great information, great resources. Hopefully everybody's convinced right now that we need to offer flexible workplaces in some way, shape, or form. And so we have a couple of questions that are already coming in through the chat. And also I had a couple of questions, but you know what, let's get to some of the questions we have here. One of them was just actually, it was, I think, around Emma, just around if some of for the 4-day week work, Andrew, if any of these workplaces were in a unionized environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the poster child for a unionized 4-day week is Volkswagen. So the Metall union in Germany negotiated a 28-hour week, not a 32-hour week, a 28-hour week with the government, with their employer. And that was all around how they enhance productivity in order to do that. And so unionized workforces sometimes are suspicious, which is why whenever we can, when we're running the pilots, we bring in, we're doing the CTU here is going to be part of our New Zealand next pilot. The big labour unions in Ireland are part of public service unions, part of their trial. What we're trying to do is prove here that actually we're not talking about reducing hours, reducing pay. And as long as you can convince a union that you're not doing that, actually they're very strong supporters of this, because this is really about, in effect, an increase in pay, a reduction in time, but it is linked to output. And I think enlightened unions see that.
Yeah, right. And I think that was a really important piece of what you said around the 180 rule. As long as people can meet that level of productivity in the way that they measure it, the way the organization measures it, and the customer experience and everything that goes along with that, then that stays and the pay stays and all of those things, right? So what about any legal kind of like employment standards legislation or anything else that you ran into?
Yeah, we did. Well, and this is why we have the opt-in process. I mean, our employment legislation in New Zealand has certain similarities to what you will see in Australia, the UK, Canada, South Africa. So this is why we use the opt-in, because we have a problem with legislation here that's quite very prescriptive as to normal hours, normal days, normal time of work. And of course, if you are changing which day you take off each week, which is part of the gig here. You can't always have a Friday, you can't always have a Monday, it depends on circumstances. So as a consequence, you have no normal hours and days of work. So how we got around that was this opt-in idea, which basically means that I gift you 40 days off a year if you do X. It also means that I've not had to change any of my core contracts of employment. They're all unchanged. And that also makes it incredibly easy. And at all that dynamic component that this is a gift and therefore there's an obligation attached to that means that you don't get backsliding. Now, the backsliding is the French problem, 35-hour week, small burst in productivity. Then once you realize there is no sanction if you don't maintain productivity, activity then slides off again and you don't see that benefit. Whereas with this, it's dynamic. You don't do your bit, I don't have to do my bit. The only downside is I have to accrue 4 days leave on the 40 days I gift my staff off a year. But I've then said, right, if you've opted in, you have to gift 1 day a quarter to charity. So whilst we don't get it back, we're making a statement that we want people to be the best they can be in the office and the best they can be in their community by paying it forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is amazing, right? And I liked how you brought up that point earlier around the impact on the overall economy. You're giving people extra time to be out and about and stimulate it, which we need right now, right? So yeah, so that's amazing. So we lost Claire. I think hopefully she'll return here in a minute. I have another question for you though, Andrew. So I have a question here from the audience. So can employees work remotely while also, this is around, okay, so can employees work remotely while also participating in this reduced work week in whatever schedule they choose, or must they report to the office location? Which I think, yeah.
This is actually a very important point, Victoria. And the reason it's important is I look at it a different way. We talk about working from home. I would put it a different way. You're not working from home, you're sleeping in the office. And that's because the natural barriers around going to and from work, which punctuated the working day, go. So one of the dangers, and some of the research over the last couple of years has shown that in fact, with working from home, the working day has expanded. There's a temptation, obviously, to do that work late at night at the kitchen table. And that actually is a bad thing because you're actually encouraging almost the wrong behaviors. So no, if we're doing remote working in our model, that's irrelevant. You are still capable of working the 4-day week remotely. We just have to make sure that the technology enables us to shut your computers off on that 5th day or half day, so that you can take a step out of it. But the whole premise here is I want my employees, and the evidence suggests it's what you want. You want your employees to be more relaxed, to be more rested. That's what drives better productivity. So if you work from home, yes, they pick up the commute time, but the danger is that just translates into work time. And a lot of the evidence suggests that the longer you make the working day, that beyond, actually starting from just beyond 8 hours, the output levels start to drop off quite markedly. And in fact, you often find it goes down if you do that in a sustained pattern. So 10-hour days in a sustained week, you'll be getting very poor productivity by the end of the week. So no, you can do both.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's some of where this right to disconnect. Ontario introduced some new legislation around having the right to disconnect. Of course, there's always a little bit flaws with something that's brand new, but it leaves it to the organization basically to come up with the policy that gives the employee the right to disconnect if they choose. So it's not a flat out, but yeah, lots of things to figure out with that, right? And in terms of public sector, government workers and things like that, have you seen experience with that? And then Claire, you're back. We'll get to you in a minute here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the poster child at the moment, bizarrely, is the United Arab Emirates, who have gone completely to a 4-day week, which is, it's pretty interesting for a couple of reasons, actually. But what we're now seeing is public sector organizations start to have this debate. There's a couple in Canada that are looking at it. I think there's one that's trialing it quite quietly. There is South Cambridgeshire Council in the UK that has announced that it's going to do it. The problem is not, can you do it in the public sector? The problem is that the media and the general public often have such a jaundiced view of the public sector that the inevitable view is, well, they're even working less than they're working already, right? Now, that's not fair, but it's a perception. So you've got to then focus very much on the outputs, and this is what we advise public sector bodies to do, which is to look at the key things that the consumers are concerned about and report on those things so that they're actually able to demonstrate either maintaining the service levels or preferably improving the service levels. And that takes that argument away. But it's always a tightrope, not so much for the organization, but for the politician who sits over the top to justify why the policy is being brought in.
Right. And it goes back to, I think, some of what you were saying around mindset and looking at, and how are we measuring productivity and performance? You know, we're not looking at hours and all of these things. There's so much in there. So let's go. So I'm going to talk a little bit more, ask couple more logistical questions about around the communication piece and getting everyone on board throughout the whole organization. So, for example, I mean, I would love to see this happen Canadian wide, even you know, having the opportunity to have just more flexible workplaces in general. But oftentimes I find there's a barrier, which is there may be a new policy that's introduced that allows something like, you know, whether it's like the earned days off or the compressed weeks, which we don't, like you said, we can see reductions in productivity if we're just extending hours on certain days. But anyways, that aside, we may offer something across an organization and they might be on board, but in a large organization, and this has happened to me working in I'm not going to say where there were specific directors within different business units who weren't fully bought on. And so while it was an organizational wide policy, it wasn't, you know, accepted or, you know, sold, or the opportunity wasn't extended to all employees because of certain bias from different leadership in different departments. So I'm wondering how about we, you know, get across that issue. And I'm wondering, Claire, if you want to pipe in on this piece.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it is always a challenge for organisations, even those that have strong flexibility cultures often do find there are pockets of resistance, you know, areas where it's perceived to be not so possible, line managers perhaps resistant to some degree. I mean, I think that one of the important things, and I think, you know, our research looking at the how the flexible furlough scheme influenced employers, but equally the work that Andrew's been doing, is where this notion of trials and encouraging employers to be more innovative in relation to their employment practices is really important to help people learn. I think, you know, we often, thinking particularly about the role of governments, we encourage businesses to be innovative in relation to their products and the services that they deliver, but we often don't encourage them to be innovative when they look internally about the way in which they manage themselves, and in particular, how they manage the staff. And I think, you know, having those kind of trials, having those kind of experiments allow, and, you know, as the work we did on the part-time working showed that employers, you know, didn't necessarily know how to do these things, weren't necessarily confident in doing it. And in this set of circumstances, in order to access support from government, they had to do it, so they had to learn, but also it challenged many of their perceptions that, you know, thinking it's not going to work in my area of the business, by actually seeing it happening and experiencing that had challenged their perceptions. So I think, you know, there's maybe issues around, you know, campaigns to try and win hearts and minds of role modeling and showing examples from other types of business. from other areas of business, but I think, particularly encouraging innovation, encouraging trials, encouraging experimentation, and, seeing it as something that's relatively short term. Even in the early days of flexible working, there were some companies that, really did run experiments around it. I remember doing a project with Microsoft in the UK, and they, challenged everybody to come up with a different way of working for a period of 3 months. There was nothing that was set in stone, nothing had to, change on an ongoing basis, but it was about saying, well, let's just think about different ways, let's try it out and see how it works. And so I think that notion of innovation in relation to employment practices is a really important one to overcome some of these kinds of barriers.
Yeah, I love that, right? Creating that culture of innovation and learning and experimentation internally, and as well as encouraging people to come up with those solutions. So involving people in the change versus suggesting and laying it out in front of them without providing that opportunity for involvement through it, right? And I think that's really probably key with implementing any major change, such as implementing much more flexible workplaces. Andrew, did you have any other comments on that?
Yeah, look, Victoria, the problem is your senior leadership team are often the most skeptical people out there on your board as well. I mean, I cracked my board problem by announcing it first on national television, and they weren't game enough to come out afterwards and say, we're going to stand up against a 4-day week. How we dealt with that problem is that we made it mandatory for our leadership team to take a 4-day. They had to walk the talk. I said to them, look, I'm not going to hold you responsible if this doesn't work. That's my call. That's on my head. But you're accountable to me to not give it the best shot. So if you act to try and stop this or undermine this, then that's a different question. Because what the 4-day week policy does, it shines a spotlight on your leaders. And often it takes a little bit of a transition time for these people to realize that actually this old command and control structure that often people have been used to has to change and has to evolve. Bizarrely, once you've got over that initial resistance, you find that they then become enthusiastic supporters because the team performs better. That makes them look better. And so, that's why I unashamedly now come from this point of productivity, better corporate performance. Because if you're saying as a leader, what we do today is the best we can do, you're saying that's the pinnacle of human achievement. Now, if that's what a leader is saying, get a different leader, right? So you turn it on its head, and actually you start to say, look, it clearly is delivering better results. We've got to do this too. You've got to do this too.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also a thing about how line managers are managed in organizations. When line managers are managed very tightly in relation to targets, it often means they're reluctant to be innovative in what they do, that they kind of have a way in which they know they can deliver, and as a result, kind of stick to established practices. I think, allowing some space to try different things that actually may deliver better is really important here. And so I think, it is indeed about senior leadership, and the role modeling, I think, is really important, but particularly in large organizations, I think, one has to look at the management structures as they go downwards in organization to say, well, actually, are you creating an environment where it's difficult for line managers to innovate in the practices, the way in which they manage people, or indeed any of their resources in some senses? So I think it's, it's looking at different hierarchical levels to say, where could there be impediments and what can be done in order to enable and create space for innovation.
Mm-hmm, right. And I think that comes down to, we know that there's clear evidence, clear research around the organizational performance metrics, and then tying that back into using a bit of that, getting those leadership right on board, and then kind of using more of that change leadership approach, right, of empowering people and inspiring people and getting them on board to innovate and figure out some of the ways that it will work logistically at the team leader and all of the different levels, right? I have another question here from the audience that it says, given the large percentage of knowledge workers in many industries, what are your thoughts as to the extent in what a 4-day week allows one's brain to, for example, decompress and then return to a heightened level of productivity? So I guess this one's for you, Andrew, but I'm sure, Claire, you probably have comments here too.
Well, look, again, there's very good evidence. Was the concept of working 57 minutes, taking 17 minutes off, working again for that. This is part and parcel of the process. I mean, there's a couple of things. I do my best thinking often when I'm walking on the beach, because my brain is not stopping thinking about my job, my companies. What I'm actually doing is I need time to step out, rethink, re-engage and be creative. Now, the challenge often in an organization is if you're task focused and you've got the interruption process going on, you actually haven't got the time to be creative. That's point number one. And if you're going full bore all the time, you haven't got the time to be creative or the chance to just step back and let your brain decompress a bit and then come up with the ideas. So I think, in many ways, this is why the argument for knowledge work is that something like a reduced hours 4-day week policy is very, very rational. You've got to finesse it slightly differently because often it's a little bit about process, a little bit more about process when you're looking at things like manufacturing. But I think it's absolutely self-evident that in industries where it's all about that intellectual engagement, then actually it makes absolute sense. And I think there's overwhelming evidence to suggest that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only at rest, right? Claire, did you have another comment on there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking particularly about the work done by psychologists on need for recovery and need for recovery specifically in the context of work. If people are working long hours, if their work is filling a lot of their time, then the opportunity to remove themselves from work and for both, mental recovery in terms of, their thinking, their ability to deal with problems, their ability to concentrate, they need to have that time to decompress, to think about completely different things, and to be able to then come back to work with a healthier, fresher mind in many senses, in the same way as we need physical recovery from perhaps doing work that may be physically very demanding for work that's intellectually demanding. It's important for that as well. And there's been really interesting work done by colleagues in the Netherlands around how flexible working offers those opportunities for recovery from work and to be able to maximize what people then bring back to work in terms of the recovered self, if you like.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the evidence is abundant, right? I think we're at time, but the evidence is abundant that it improves organizational performance from employee engagement to customer experience, and the list goes on, right? And it helps employee well-being. It's the right thing to do. It helps support the economy in terms of just offering more flexible choices and giving people that time in the recovery. Given the state of our echo pandemic of poor mental well-being, I think it's, now is the time to look at investing. And it's not invest. Yeah, I mean, you don't even have to really put much of an investment in it whatsoever. You're just going to reap the benefits if you focus in on supporting more flexible workplaces. So I want to thank both of you, and I think Emma has some words here to say. But this has been a really enlightening session, I think, hopefully for everybody here. So yeah, hopefully we can all go ahead and make more flexible workplaces.
What a great discussion on such an important and relevant topic. Thank you, Claire, Andrew, and Victoria. I want to say to all participants, if you are interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, again, please navigate to the accreditation opportunities page in the menu. By purchasing all 3 panel certificates today, you will receive an annual WWI membership, guaranteeing unlimited certificates for e-courses, webinars, and more. And organizational and individual WWI members will receive a free certificate. And just like that, we have completed our 3 panel sessions, but I'm happy to say the conversation does not end here. In our final time together today, we are excited to invite some of our panelists back to a roundtable discussion to go over all your practical implementation questions on workplace wellness. During registration, you were able to write in your burning implementation questions. We're so grateful for all of the submissions we received, and we'll use this time to go over some of the larger themes of questions we were able to assemble. Remember, you are more than welcome to add any new questions or thoughts that have come up throughout the day in the feed loop chat. I'm happy to reintroduce Todd Humber from Northwall Media, who will be moderating this discussion. He'll be joined by our panelist, Dr. Susan Peters from Harvard University, Nicolette Gower